Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, February 1946, just hours after being honorably discharged from the United States Army, a South Carolina man by the name of Isaac Woodard Jr. was attacked and beaten by police while taking a bus ride home. He was still wearing his uniform. After getting into a verbal altercation with the bus driver and then the police, he was taken into custody and beaten. The next morning, he appeared before a local judge where he was convicted of drunken and disorderly conduct and fined $50. In court, Woodard claimed that he was beaten for addressing officers by yes instead of yes, sir. Look, this incident sparked a national outrage, tapped into a larger conversation about the role of Black Americans in fighting for the United States in the Second World War and then returning to a country that didn't recognize their rights or full citizenship. So, here to discuss the Woodard incident, Black vets, and lots more are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Matthew Delmont, history professor at Dartmouth University and author of the book Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. So, Matt, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I guess we'll get into the details of the Woodard incident, but, you know, we remember his name. It was notable. You wrote about him in your book. But, like, how unique was his experience, this incident, really?
So what's unique about the Woodard case is the national attention it received. This kind of violence against Black troops and Black veterans was unfortunately too commonplace during World War II. During the war, there were numerous incidents that were reported in the Black press of Black troops being attacked, in some cases even killed, while in the service of their country, and often in these kind of mundane bus incidents that kind of were precursors to the much larger Rosa Parks bus incident in the mid-1950s. After the war, there were at least a dozen Black veterans who were attacked or murdered for incidents similar to Woodard's, being too proud of their uniform or not being willing to accept their second-class status. What made Woodard's case really unique was the particular violence of the attack, the fact that his eyes were gouged out and the pictures of him being blinded were circulated nationally. And then just the fact that it resonated not just within Black America, within the Black press, but it really resonated across white America as well. Once Orson Welles took on the case, received a huge amount of national attention. Woody Guthrie and others publicized the case. And so that really is what made the Woodard case unique, is that it wasn't just something that mattered to Black Americans, but it came to matter to white Americans and eventually to President Truman as well.
You know, I'm always struck by these stories because I tell my students in class about the Double V campaign and how Black Americans were fighting for victory abroad, but also victory at home, and trying to bring attention to the fact that of all things to sort of start riots or violent acts was the uniform, like the military uniform that sparked this outrage of like, how dare you call yourself American? And so when soldiers are coming back home wearing these uniforms, they inadvertently make themselves target of violence among, you know, these racist groups that cannot stand to envision sort of American citizenship in Black bodies. I don't know. Could you talk a little bit about the role of the uniform? Like, should they have just come home in plain dress clothing? Would that have made a difference?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because one of the most troubling things that came across in research was an example of exactly that. There was a father who brought overalls to meet his son when he got discharged from the military, and his son changed immediately in the back of the car, changed from his military uniform into overalls so he would be safe once he got home.
Wow.
It's such an upsetting part of this history because it so directly counters the kind of mythological history we have of World War II, where we would like to think that the country was united, that everyone welcomed the veterans back home after their tremendous sacrifices. But that was not the case for Black veterans. They were regarded with hostility in many countries. And the fact that they were wearing their uniforms and proud of it was upsetting enough to a lot of white Americans that they were willing to take on violence to try to, quote unquote, put Black soldiers back in their place.
And such an inversion of the expectations for white men in uniform, right? That the uniform was something that commanded respect. And precisely because of that, it becomes something that some white people see Black people in the uniform, and it upsets the entire system.
Exactly. And that's what's so disturbing to Black Americans throughout the war, is that it goes directly against what the military is meant to represent. The GI stands for general issue, right? So there's supposed to be something about wearing this military uniform that's supposed to bring honor and dignity, but also provide a unifying factor across different demographics. And it's just not the reality for what Black Americans experience in the service of their country.
I think there's a story that we tell about the military as a place where people who are oppressed or who are treated unequally can go to the military and they can get access to citizenship and they can get access to equal treatment. And it is a way of kind of proving your citizenship or proving your ability to be a citizen. And it really undermines that story that I think we like to tell when you hear what happens after people come home.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the hopes and aspirations Black Americans have had throughout every military conflict the United States has ever been a part of. Black Americans served in the American Revolution, in the Civil War, in World War I, World War II. And the hope going into each of those conflicts was if we show our patriotism, if we show our bravery, that is going to do something to help advance the cause for equal rights, help advance the cause for civil rights. And every time that aspiration was thwarted, things in many cases got worse at the end of the war because the white communities wanted to put Black communities and Black veterans back in their place. But I think you're right that there remains an idea about military service that it does open doors. And there is a part of that story that is true. I think getting later to the Woodard story, it does help to influence the desegregation of the military in 1948. And at that point, the military, it does move to a more leading position in terms of racial equality relative to other institutions in the country.
Before we get back to the details of the Woodard case, I'm also curious, another dimension here is that we've talked about it a number of times on this show, but, when Black soldiers are abroad, they're being told, why are you fighting for this country that doesn't treat you like a full citizen, and then they're even seeing sort of, what life is like in parts of Europe or wherever. And so how much is that kind of present in mind? I don't know if you know the specifics for Woodard, but just as vets return home, how much has their thinking shifted about what the U.S. makes of them, and how much are they sort of girding themselves for returning to a country that doesn't treat them as equal citizens?
I think Kellie mentioned earlier the Double Victory campaign, which really becomes the rallying cry for Black Americans during the war. They're fighting not only for victory over fascism abroad, but victory over racism at home. And like Kellie and Nicole, I've taught about this topic for more than a decade. And I think I too easily accepted that as a rhetorical device. That sort of Double Victory was a sort of rhetorical framing that sort of framed how Black people thought about the war during World War II. But it was much, much more than that. It truly was a battle on two fronts. Black Americans who were in the service of our country wanted to achieve those military victories, and they played a really important part in helping America and the Allies win the war. But they also saw the battle on the home front as being an equal, and in fact, larger part of the battle. That for Black Americans, the war didn't end in 1945 because they wanted to make sure they had actual freedom and democracy at home. It wasn't enough to just achieve these goals abroad. They wanted to make sure they had it at home. And so while I can't speak specifically to how Woodard understood this, for that whole generation of Black servicemen and women and veterans, they come home and they're adamant in demanding the kind of rights that they deserve. They really want to reshape America and make America a country worth fighting for. They want some of the freedom and democracy that they had just risked their lives to secure abroad.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
It's probably also worth mentioning that the forces in which they were fighting during World War II was a segregated armed service. How was that for Northern Black soldiers? Was that a new situation? How did they respond to the fact that the military was segregated?
It was a very upsetting experience for Black servicemen and women to be put into a segregated military, and particularly for those who came from cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit. Which is not to say that racism and discrimination didn't exist outside the South, but the stories that they told about being sent to these army bases, which were largely in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, is that they described getting on trains and then being sent to the South. And at the demarcation point of the South, Washington, D.C. or other cities, they had to move to the Jim Crow section of the train. When they pulled into these southern towns, they had to pull down the shades on the train cars to make sure that the white townspeople wouldn't throw rocks at the train cars because they were so upset about the idea of Black troops being stationed there in the South. And then they describe just the constant day-to-day hostility they received from officers, from white enlisted men. And then when they would go into these small towns in the South for the 24-hour, 48-hour recreation that they had, they were harassed by white sheriffs and townspeople, by bus drivers, not dissimilar to the Woodard incident. Things got so bad that there were hundreds of these black soldiers who wrote to the NAACP, to people like Thurgood Marshall, saying, you have to do something to help us here. We would actually feel safer if we deploy to Europe or the Pacific than we feel here in Mississippi, Alabama, or Georgia. They literally describe themselves as being at war already in the United States with their own white countrymen.
Wow. I wonder, just coming back to Woodward, if you could talk about just the incident itself. Like, it seems very intentional that there's a move to blind him, whether that's beating him or gouging out his eyes. I wonder if this really has nothing to do with sir or yes or no, but as a larger sort of plot to harm this man, regardless of what he said or didn't say, or, the circumstances around that. I mean, I don't think that there's anything that could really precipitate this kind of violence, but could you sort of talk about the larger like social climate and norms about how Black people were expected to interact with white people, especially when they're, moving about among public transportation?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kellie. The larger context is that there are really two competing visions for what America is going to be after the war. For Black veterans like Isaac Woodard, they want equality. They want to be full citizens. For a lot of white Americans, or too many white Americans, particularly in the South, they want things to be how they were before the start of the war. Right? And that means a return to Jim Crow segregation, or racial apartheid system, where Blacks are expected to be second-class citizens and to accept that status, to sit in the back of the bus, to step off the sidewalk when a white person's passing, and to address white people regardless of their age or professional status as sir. And so I think what happened with the Woodard case, he was trying to return home on a Greyhound bus. And the driver, from what we can glean, seemed to be almost prodding him to react, right? So it's such a mundane situation, right? Someone on a bus asking about a bathroom break during a rest stop, and the driver takes offense at Woodard's first request of it, and then how long he's taking with the bathroom break. Then the ability of the bus driver to call the police when they get to the next town to have Woodard taken off the bus. I think that's one of the important parts of the context, is that these bus drivers, they, in some cases, were officially deputized to act as sheriffs or as police officers. And even when they weren't officially so, they carried themselves with that same kind of status to enforce the customs and order. For Woodard and others, they don't want to have to accept that same kind of status. And I think that's the set of conflicting visions that come into conflict in the Woodard case. But the bus driver and the police officers are the ones that have the power to be able to enforce their vision of who has what kind of rights in post-war America. And then the violence of the attack, unfortunately, it's one of the through lines of police engagements with Black communities throughout the 20th century. I think that's what's so upsetting about the Woodard case, is that you can see examples prior to the war. You can see examples from the 1950s, 60s, the 80s, the 2000s, last week.
Yeah.
It never stops. And for me as a historian, I was writing this chapter, the Homecoming chapter, where I talk about Woodard in the summer of 2020, right? And thinking about both the violence, but also the efforts of the civil rights activists in 1946 to do very much the same thing that people were trying to do after George Floyd's murder. Try to call attention to this violence and encourage people to see it as a system of violence, not just an isolated incident.
This is such an important part of the story, that after Woodard is attacked and after his story is circulating, particularly in the Black community, you have the head of the NAACP who's meeting with the president of the United States, Harry Truman, and Truman is dragging his feet when it comes to doing anything on Black civil rights. And it's at that moment that, is it White that's the head of the NAACP at the time? Yeah. That White comes forward and he tells this story of Woodard and what happened to him. And he reports back that Truman was so stunned by the story and by the level of violence. And I think that's why the kind of visceral attack on Woodard is so important, that he finally gets off the fence and starts to put together a commission and to move forward on desegregating the military. There is real action that comes out of this.
That's exactly right. I think it builds on years of civil rights activism and protest. The fact that Walter White can get an audience with President Truman, that Truman knows that he's received calls for this for months in his presidency, and then his predecessor FDR had received demands in terms of addressing civil rights and addressing the direct violence against Black troops and veterans during his presidency. For Truman, I think the fact that he was a veteran himself from the First World War, he described that as being important to how he reacted to the Woodard case. And I think, as you're saying, the question of what politicians were willing and able to hear and to recognize as a problem was vital to this. That for a lot of Black readers and Black Americans, they were familiar with cases like Woodard's because these were in Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, consistently during the 1940s and years before. Too often for white politicians like Truman, they didn't see it, or they refused to hear it, or refused to see it as something that they could do something about. And thankfully, with the Woodard case, it finally does turn the tide for Truman. It's the thing that finally convinces him that he has to form this commission, that even within the limitations of what the commission is able to produce, it does finally lead to the executive order that desegregates the military in 1948.
What I think is really incredible about this is whether Truman acted or not, Black people themselves were on the ground, like galvanizing for this cause. So there's a huge, benefit concert in his honor. People like Billie Holiday and, Woody Guthrie and Joe Louis show up. 20,000 people come out to this concert. They raise about $10,000, which is over $130,000, like in today's money, to help his family. Because, in instances like this, there is no reparations for people that, once you lose your eyesight, you're effectively unable to stay in the military anymore. Any job that requires sight, and almost most jobs do, you are now ineligible for those positions. So being able to provide for himself and to continue to have a livelihood is so important. And to see how the Black community really shows up for him and make sure that he's taken care of, I think is really inspiring. And yet at the same time, it's infuriating to see what the federal government's not willing to do.
So we have this public pressure, as you were just describing, and then Truman is involved, and he orders a federal investigation because South Carolina, no surprise, is sort of dragging its feet here. It eventually goes to trial, November 1946, a trial about whether the police chief, whose last name is Shull, used excessive or unnecessary force. They show all the medical records in the trial. Shull claims he only hit Woodard once. An all-white jury convenes for 30 minutes. And Matt, what happens?
And they find him not guilty. They acquit him. So there's no justice taken in the beating of Woodard.
The ripple effects of this feel really important, though, because the judge at the trial was so disgusted by how quickly the jury returned its verdict, by the verdict itself, that he became somebody invested in civil rights activism going forward. Julian Bond, who would emerge as a civil rights leader, talks about how for him, it's these first images that he saw of Woodard that just like stayed in his memory. It was kind of like the first images that he saw of this kind of violence. And he talks about how it would stay with him for the rest of his life. So there's that immediate reaction, which is so important. But then there's the very long tail of the people whose lives are shaped by Woodard's story.
That's a great point. I think for someone like Julian Bond, he describes the Woodard incident as being almost like an Emmett Till kind of moment, right? Yeah. Seeing the images, the violence, and understanding what it meant. Even as a young person, they stuck with him and influenced the amazing career he had as a civil rights activist. The judge you mentioned, Judge Waring, it really does shape his life. And there's a really good book by Richard Gergel called Unexampled Courage that sort of talks about that larger story of Woodard and then the awakening of Truman and Judge Waring. With Waring, he has a really interesting dissenting opinion in the Briggs versus Elliott case in 1952. That's a precursor to the Brown versus Board case. And what I think is particularly important about that is Briggs, the father in that case, the plaintiff, Harry Briggs, was himself a veteran. And so it's another kind of through line of how Black veterans in every community were advocating for equal rights and civil rights. And thankfully, in Judge Waring's case, there were increasingly white Americans who understood the urgency of this and were willing to use some of their professional ability and professional and social capital to actually do something about it.
Can I ask a question? I don't know if you'll be able to answer or not, but how should we make sense of Black involvement in the U.S. military today? I know that, when you look at the United States military, it's incredibly diverse, but still not so much when it comes to officers versus enlisted, when it comes to generals and people who are in power. Have we seen, more change? Have we seen regression? Like, how do we, I guess, reconcile the moments of, the post-World War II moment with now?
It's a great question, Kellie. It's one I've been thinking a lot about. I would say with the military, I think two things are true at the same time. I think one thing is that since 1948, I would argue that the military has been, if there's a spectrum, it's been not more on the forward-looking part of the spectrum with regards to racial equity and equality, right? Which is not to say things are perfect in the military by any stretch of the imagination, but relative to other parts of corporate America, relative to academia, the military, because it needs to draw from a wider demographic range, it's had to think longer and harder about issues like diversity and inclusivity than higher education has, for example. Since 1973, after the Vietnam War, once the military became an all-volunteer force, Black Americans have been overrepresented in the military. They've elected to go into military service for a variety of reasons, but in part because military service has provided, in some cases, better professional opportunities than the civilian world has. I think there are pros and cons to that. What it means to have to risk your life to get a good job or to get training is, I think, a larger commentary about other aspects of our society, more so than about the military. But I think there are a lot of positive things to say on the military ledger, I think. On the flip side, we've seen plenty of examples of how racism is still deeply embedded in many aspects of the military. I think the white nationalist strains are present and haven't been fully rooted out. The fact that it's only really in the last few years that the military has taken seriously how many parts of the military are named after Confederate generals and soldiers, right? That's, from a military perspective, it's almost an absurd legacy to be honoring, since the Confederacy was fighting against the U.S. Army. And then, as you noted, is a glass ceiling, right? So while Black Americans and other people of color are overrepresented in the military broadly, they're not overrepresented at the officer ranks. And so I think when I think about the military today, I think both things are true. I think it has thought longer and harder about what it means to be an inclusive organization, which I think is laudable. But I think there are still many aspects that where racism remains in sort of the day-to-day operations.
As we wrap up, let's tie up some of the remaining details about Woodard himself and his legacy. 2018, the drunken disorderly conviction is finally vacated many, many years later. He didn't receive disability benefits from the Army until 1962, and I suppose there was some legislation that kind of also shifted too about when you can receive disability benefits and people who are injured in that window between when they're discharged and when they get back home. But any other, there's a plaque.
It's always a plaque.
Yeah, in Batesburg, Leesville. This one, we keep track of plaques around here, and this one is fairly substantive, I would say. Some other ones kind of undersell the scope of the story, but there's a plaque.
And it's in print and it's in Braille, which seems like a particularly important touch.
Yeah. Any other tidbits from this story, Matt, or any other kind of related stories that pop up in your book or your research do you feel like are worth layering in here?
I think the two things I would mention, I think part of what's important about Woodard's story is it gives us a window to look back into World War II and understand some of the realities of what the war was actually about, right? Woodard was not the only person who was beaten, not the only Black veteran who was beaten or attacked. And I think if we can talk honestly, reckon honestly with that history, we'll be better positioned to understand some of what we've been living through in the last several years, that this isn't new, right? That the part of what we all know as historians, that this has been going on for many, many years. And part of the urgency of what's going on right now is the fact that people's grandparents have been fighting the same battles in the same streets for years and years. And the other thing I would mention in terms of things that have Woodard's name on it is that there's legislation that was proposed last year called the GI Bill Restoration Act that's named in part after Isaac Woodard. It was advanced by Representative Claiborne and Representative Moulton and Senator Warnock. Which would seek to provide GI Bill benefits to the surviving descendants of Black World War II veterans who were denied those benefits. Now, given the context of things in Washington, D.C., it's unlikely that that's ever going to get out of committee. But again, I think it's another occasion to think seriously about what it means to for the country to pay the debt it owes to that generation of Black veterans whose service I don't think was ever fully acknowledged or appreciated.
Yeah. You just opened up a whole nother can of worms, a whole nother episode on how to make sense of the GI Bill and who gets what. There's so much there. That's another lecture I give in my class about like who gets what and who gets left out of those GI benefits.
Yeah. All right. Well, the book is Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. And our guest has been Matthew Delmont, history professor at Dartmouth. Matt, thank you so much for doing this. This was incredibly interesting. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
All right. We did it.
Do you want to say goodbye to me and Kellie?
Oh, I do want to say goodbye to you, Kellie. Good call. I always do that. And I've probably forgotten like twice in 400 episodes, but thank you. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.